this is Chloe at Happy, Healthy, and Homegrown, and today I want to talk to you about some easy sourdough hacks and the really simple recipe I use to make everything you can think of with sourdough. It makes doing sourdough super simple. You don't need any fancy gadgets, you don't need a proofing dish, you don't need any special cooking things. You can use what you already have in your kitchen plus some sourdough starter, which you can usually find on any social media group. You can just post in a group and someone probably has some. How to still make a really great loaf every time without having to be so detailed. So if you're one of those people who likes a bunch of details, I'm going to be specific, but this might drive you crazy a little bit because I'm going to make it simple. I would use white flour that doesn't have added folic acid and all the fake synthetic vitamins they add to white flour these days, and also unbleached. So organic white flour, plain and simple, best ingredient. Who doesn't love fresh bread that feels good on your stomach? And I've got a busy life, so I want sourdough in my life because it's healthier, but I don't want to be committed to a lot of dishes, and I don't want to be committed to a lot of measuring and a lot of steps and process. For those of you who've made sourdough before, hopefully this isn't too redundant for you, but I'm going to be a little bit simple here because some people haven't made sourdough before. At the end of this video, I'm going to do a quick overview of the nutritional benefits of sourdough in case you don't know, and why it's a better alternative to almost every other kind of bread out there. Check it out. If you haven't heard about sourdough, scroll to the end of the video to watch that part. So here's my sourdough starter, and I usually feed it twice a day, but if you're too busy, you can only feed it once a day. That works too. I used to always get hesitant about when to start my bread because I was always worried about has it fully increased and doubled in volume, and is it active enough to make the bread rise right? And I used to get flat loaves about a third of the time because my sourdough starter wasn't active enough and those kind of issues. So let me tell you, one of the biggest secrets to not having that problem is to use a lot more sourdough starter. Then you don't have all that extra starter you have to throw away every day as well. So when you want to make a loaf of sourdough, it's really simple every time. Now this has been fed quite a while ago, at least 4 or 5 hours ago, so it's not as active, but there's still some bubbles in it. So if you're going to make something, you want to have at least a few bubbles in there, show that it's somewhat active. How many bubbles are in here, but there are some bubbles in here. It's bubbling, it's active, but it's not maybe quite double in volume, super active right now. But there is more than half a cup of sourdough here. In fact, this is a quart jar, so this is almost 16 ounces of sourdough starter here. And most recipes call for half a cup, which is about 4 ounces. What I always do now that I learned this trick from my sister is I will pour almost the entire starter in. And instead of just putting 1/4 of a cup in, I'm going to dump. I'm not even going to measure, I'm just going to dump a bunch of this in until I have just a little bit left there that I can restart from. So I leave about 4 ounces, 3 ounces left in the bottom of the jar. It's about this full right here. I'm going to add some flour water to that. And here I have probably 1.5 cups of sourdough starter in my bowl. So instead of half a cup, I'm going to go with 1.5 cups. This is a tablespoon scoop, but I use about half of a tablespoon because pink salt isn't quite as salty. And it has a lot of good trace minerals for you. What you want to do is add your liquids next. About 1 1/3 cup of warm water. Here's 1 cup, 1/3 cup. And here's what I wanted to say about recipe making. You basically have one recipe and you make everything out of it. I mean, there are probably some nuances of some things, but for me, I make bagels, I make pizza dough, I make jalapeno cheese bread, I make raisin bread, I make sourdough bread, and I use the exact same recipe every time. So this is a recipe for 1 loaf, but I always make it into 2 loaves, and you know why? A couple reasons: because you can give one away to a friend. Another reason is you can save one for later in a bag or something that keeps it from getting dried out. And the third is it cooks half the cook time, and it's pretty simple to cook without burning edges and without making the middle too doughy. If your loaf is really big, then you have to cook it a long time to get all the way to the center. So 1, you're saving a lot of utilities, energy, and 2, you don't have to worry about burning the bread as much because you don't cook it very long. So let me just put my 4 cups of flour, and I use white wheat flour. So not whole wheat. So there's 2 cups. I stir this in. You want to use a plastic spoon or a rubber coated this or that. I have this little thingamajigger. You guys, I am just like simple in the kitchen. I don't have all these fancy tools. And the thing that's intimidating about sourdough for a lot of people is you think you need one of these little proofing things with the liner that's made out of linen or whatever, and I had some of those and I actually gave them away because sourdough is not as picky as people try to make it sound. I just use a plain glass bowl, and then I cook it in these 2 pie dishes with my bread, or I cook it in my toaster oven on this little cookie sheet if I'm making like a small batch and putting some of it in the fridge. And I have a small pot that I boil the bagels in when I make bagels. So you really don't need anything but your basic kitchen utensils and your basic kitchen items. So here is 4 cups. And when you get to this point, the consistency is getting a little thicker. I like to stir in the 2 cups first, and then when I get to the 4th one, that's when I have to switch to my hands. So it's starting to get a little thicker here. This is when it gets kind of messy. And with this step, you just kind of roll and twist until you get all the flours tucked into it. You don't want it to be too dry. If I turn it out and it ends up looking a little dry, I just throw a tiny bit of warm water on top just to make sure the outside doesn't dry out. So here's my consistency right there. Sticking to my hands. Nice and sticky, but not too sticky. And that's perfect right here. See that? That's the consistency I usually go for, or even a smidge wetter, just because I live in Arizona and so things dry out here when I do overnight rising, which I do a lot. Sometimes the top of my loaf will get a little crusty overnight, even with a wet towel over it. So I have to make sure that my dough isn't too dry, and I make sure that that I leave a wet towel over it. What you do is you get a dish towel of any kind, wet it in your sink, and then you put it over your dish so that it keeps it from drying out on the top. And sometimes it will get really big and stick to this a little bit, but it's not a big deal. So minimum 8 hours to rise, and depending on how cold your house is. We live in Arizona, so it's usually warm here. It's usually about 80 in our house, so stuff rises pretty well here. The bread can rise for 14 hours or 16 hours. If you make it at 7 o'clock at night and you want to fiddle with it about 8 in the morning, it's just fine. You can let it rise for 14 hours or whatever. It's just make sure your towel can get re-wetted if you can, so it doesn't dry out. But sometimes when it has a little crust on the top, like this morning I had my sourdough and there was a little crust on the top, I just kneaded it into the bread, and then it rose for another hour, and when I baked it, there wasn't any hard crunchy spots in it. It was perfect. So I'm going to feed this starter now, since I just took a lot from it. I have my little plastic spoon sitting in my flour, and you don't have to feed it. This is another thing that doesn't have to be really specific. You can feed it. You don't want to feed it more than like 2 or 3 twice what's in there already, but you don't have to be too particular about feeding. You can go 50-50. That's kind of what most recipes are, is something around 50-50 with water and flour. And you want kind of room temperature water. If you give it hot water, it'll get too active. You don't want to give it hot water, because that's not good for it, but just room temperature or slightly warm. So here's a simple paper towel. This is a quart-sized glass jar and a little rubber band, and it just sits on the side there and does its thing. And then every week or so I pour it into a new jar and rinse this one, because it starts to get kind of thick and built up on the top inside there, you can see. As long as there's no mold or anything growing in your jar, your sourdough is fine. If you don't switch jars ever, then you'll eventually start to grow mold inside of there. But if you live in a really damp, humid place, you might need to switch your jar out more often because you might have more mold issues. We don't have a lot of mold in Arizona. So here's another visual of the consistency of the dough, and after you've done your bulk rise, your 12-hour or so rise, you're going to knead it one last time, let it rise for another hour, and then you're going to shape it into whatever you want it to be or stick it in the fridge, either way. Here is some sourdough bread out of the fridge. It's starting to overflow its bounds. But when you pull your sourdough out of the fridge after sitting in there for however long, what you want to do is you want it to warm up. So don't go sticking it in the oven too quickly, but let it warm up. Knead it into a bowl with some flour, just a little flour on the sides just to help it not get sticky. Knead it into a bowl, let it warm up, let it rise and get active again until it's room temperature. And then you can roll your goodies into it, whatever you want to add, or if you just want plain sourdough. This one's straight out of the fridge. It's very cold and puffy, and it actually grew a bunch even while it was in the fridge. So that's actually a great way to make your sourdough more sour, or to have it more fermented if you're one of those people that has gluten sensitivities. So this is nice and cold, and I'm going to let it warm up to room temperature. For making bread, what you'll do is, so this is my stuff that just got finished with its bulk rise. Actually, I pulled this one out of the fridge, and so it did a bulk rise, and now it's ready to do something with. So what you can do if you want to add toppings into your bread at this point is stretch it out and sprinkle it with raisins, or sprinkle it with jalapenos and cheese, or cinnamon and sugar, whatever you want to sprinkle it with. And then you'll roll all those toppings in, and then you'll kind of start to shape it again. So you kind of like tuck it under a little bit, shape it like that, and you shape it back into a loaf. And then once your loaf is shaped, you'll let it rise in your dish that you're going to cook it in. So at this point, you'll put your olive oil in the bottom of your parchment paper in the bottom of your little dish. In this case, it's a pie dish for me. And then I just put the seam, the ugly side down, not the ugly, it's all beautiful. And I put the soft side up, and then it's gonna rise like that in my dish for 30 minutes to an hour and a half. Since this pie dish fits in my toaster oven, I can also cook this loaf of bread in my toaster oven too. My toaster oven is a pizza-sized toaster oven. And since we don't use microwaves for anything, our toaster oven is our hardworking kitchen appliance. After I've put what I want in my loaf, put it in a pie dish with parchment paper, and then I spread coconut oil on the bottom. And then I put it in here, and because it's so dry in Arizona, I put the wet cloth back over it so that it doesn't get too dried out while it's drying. And then I'm going to leave both of these to rise for an hour and a half till I have time to bake them. So I'm getting ready to bake these loaves. My oven has almost finished preheating, and these have been rising, doing their last rising for about 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm just gonna make some cuts in them so that they can raise better. So you want to try to do deep cuts as you can. And you can make really cool patterns out of it if you want. The nice thing is, even if it looks funny, when it finishes cooking, it always looks pretty awesome. So this knife with some more teeth works a little better for making some nice. It needs to be able to grow quickly from the inside, and so you'll get a more even cook if you have some good cuts on it. Because I took one loaf recipe and cut it in half, I usually end up cooking these about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, which is a much faster cook time than cooking a big loaf. So it doesn't use as much energy because I'm only running my oven for a half hour instead of an hour and a half. And I don't have to go through all the extra processes of taking the lid off and all that stuff afterward. I just cook it and keep an eye on it. I don't have to uncover it, cover it, do all these fancy steps. I just keep an eye on it till it's a little golden. I turn my oven off and maybe leave it in there another 5 minutes, or if I caught it when it was already pretty golden, I just let it finish cooling on the countertop for 20 minutes or so, and the inside will finish cooking just perfectly. My loaves are just a tiny bit crunchy, so I'm going to turn the oven off and let it go another 5 minutes until they're golden brown. So this loaf is a little golden on the top, and I just pulled it out. It's going to continue cooling and finish cooking on the inside. So I usually pull it out of the pan and onto my cutting board, and then I let it finish cooling on the cutting board. Here is my jalapeno and cheddar sourdough loaf. I want to have a really sharp bread knife for cutting it is most ideal. And of course, it's the most delicious when it's fresh and hot out of the oven. This one didn't get quite as brown, so I was just letting it cook a little bit longer, but this one you can see more of the cheese and jalapenos popping out. The reason I let my bread cool on a wood cutting board is because it's more breathable than a hard surface countertop. So this will cause condensation on the bottom of your bread and will make it get mushy on the bottom instead of cooling off from the top, bottom, in all directions. Or a wire rack, that's best. I don't have a wire rack because I try to be a minimalist in my kitchen. I recently cleared out all of the things that I knew I could do without. So there's a lot of things I realized I can do without. Like even these 2 pie dishes, I can use them for a lot of things, including making great breads. So I cooked these 2 loaves in the oven because I had 2 of them, and these 2 pie dishes I couldn't cook at once in here. But I also do cook my sourdough in this little toaster oven, which is a pizza-sized toaster oven. Sourdough is one of the easiest digest breads in the world because for thousands of years people have eaten sourdough. The sourdough culture actually metabolizes the gluten and eats it up and transforms it into a fermented substance, which is easier for your body to digest. 200 years ago or so in France, there was the invention of quick rise yeast. Now, quick rise yeast just feeds on sugar, puts air into your bread and puffs it up, but it does nothing to change the structure of the flour. So now our shelves are packed with all kinds of grains that have not been fermented in any form, and so they're detrimental to our bodies because they rob minerals from our body in order to process them, because grains have a lot of phytates in them, which keep them from sprouting until they get in the ground. So you can have your grain on the shelf for 2, 5, 10 years. You can find it in King Tut's tomb, 1,000 years later, and it still can be sprouted because it has its own natural preservative in it. So when you grind that grain and eat it without doing anything to transform it, those natural enzyme inhibitors in it also block the digestion in your body and rob your body of minerals in order to process it. That's why we eat only sourdough as much as possible, and that's why I love making sourdough at home, because I can make literally everything I normally love. Cinnamon rolls, pizza dough, bagels, bread. Taste 100 times better. I don't feel bloated after, I don't feel exhausted, I don't feel sugared. Also, people who are diabetic will say that when they check their insulin after eating sourdough, it doesn't rise very much, and when they eat regular white flour bread, it rises a lot. So white flour bread is like sugar. Sourdough bread is like protein. And gluten in it is what is a problem for people, but it's also what makes it sticky. And the other thing about gluten is actually another name for protein. So our wheat over the last 100 years has been hybridized, which is not the same as GMO, but hybridized to make it higher in protein, and protein is gluten. So higher gluten flour and wheat means that there's more protein in it. But with that said, many people have gluten issues with their gut. So when you ferment it in the souring process, you actually get something that's easy to digest and has good protein content. Many people with gluten sensitivities and intolerances, and even some people with celiac who can completely tolerate sourdough bread. The more intently your problem is with gluten, the longer you should ferment your sourdough. So you can do a 24-hour ferment as well with your sourdough. That's ideal for people with like celiac and more intense issues with sourdough. And You can go online and find like a bazillion awesome things that you can do with your bread and make it into. So whatever creativity pops into your mind. I'm gonna do a quick segment on how to make the bagel part here as well. But other than that, you pretty much start everything with just the basic dough. So that to say, I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out my other quick videos on how to make bagels, cinnamon rolls, and pizza dough. And let me know your tips for making great sourdough bread and any recipes that you love. And I'd love to hear how sourdough bread and sourdough bread products have benefited your family as well.